Love staying informed? Subscribe now and get unlimited access to local news, weather, and sports for just 99 cents a month for your first 3 months at inforum.news/join. Read every story, listen to every podcast, and download the apps that keep you informed and on the go 24 hours a day. So head to inforum.news/join right now to subscribe. What are you waiting for? Get 3 months of local news for just 99 cents a month at inforum.news/join.
Welcome to Plain Talk. Happy to be with you this Friday where everybody, I like it when it becomes January and everybody in North Dakota starts complaining about the weather. Like we didn't all choose to live in North Dakota where it does this literally every year. It's cold in January and February, so I don't want to hear it. I wish we had video right now that you all could see this. Chad Oban now has a mustache, inexplicably. He is looking very dapper, though, I must say. Yeah, the mustache suits you. You grow a good one.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. I think what makes the mustache particularly appealing is the multi colors that it comes in these days.
It's very distinguished.
A little bit of white, a little bit of
salt
gray,
and
a
pepper.
little bit of dark.
Yeah.
Well, it's more. Yeah, it's certainly more salt than pepper these days.
You are very, very old. Somebody who is not looking old, who in fact is looking young and vigorous, is our guest Trygve Hammer. He's running for the United States House of Representatives. You may recognize him. He ran for the Public Service Commission last cycle. Before that, he made an unsuccessful attempt at the State House of Representatives. But now here he's running for the United States House of Representatives, and he's joining us on the program. Trygve, how are you?
I'm good. Happy to be here, Rob.
Well, happy to have you on.
And Chad is looking very distinguished.
He is, yes.
Thank you, sir.
Because we like to ask the questions that matter on this show. I wanted to know, how much of MC Hammer's repertoire are you planning on using for your campaign music?
Oh, probably none. I think there might be a little Peter Gabriel Sledgehammer.
Oh, okay.
Now you might do that little can't touch this. I'll probably get on TikTok and I got to learn that shuffle dance and.
If you don't shuffle onto the stage at the Democratic convention to "You Can't Touch This," I'm going to be disappointed. Although I don't know if I'm going to be there for it. I mean, the Republicans and the Democrats scheduled their conventions at the same time. So now I got to figure out where I'm going to be. I have a feeling there may be more drama at the Republican convention than at the Democratic convention that might necessitate my attendance there. But we'll see. Actually, so far, Trygve, you've kind of spoken about, speaking about Republican drama, you've spoken about that a little bit. Your campaign's still pretty new, but in some of the comments I've read in the press, you've been talking about dysfunction in the Republican Party as a part of your campaign. Expand on that a little bit.
Well, right now I'm running for the Democratic nomination. That is where my focus is. You haven't heard me say a whole lot about Kelly Armstrong because this is not a sure thing. I'm out the gate. I'm the first one out the gate. That's a big advantage. Raising money. In fact, I have already raised more this campaign, and we've only been going maybe a week raising money. I've raised more than I did in that 2022 cycle. Frankly, I learned a lot from that, and we're starting to apply it.
How much have you raised?
Oh, I don't even know the exact number now. We were tracking it and looked at what we had and what I had in 2022, which was pretty pathetic. And then realized that we'd gotten beyond that now. And you go to call people to ask them for money, and it's a really uncomfortable thing. Like before every call, you're like, who am I to be asking this person for some of their hard-earned money? But then you kind of get over it. Remember that you're the guy that stepped into the fray for them, and maybe they should appreciate that a little bit. And I had someone email me last night. They said, I'm going to donate to your campaign once you get the nod. So it's definitely not a sure thing, but I think we're doing a good job, and I feel pretty confident that we're going to leave the convention as the nominee.
Trygve, I think one of the things that's unique about you is your military background. Can you talk a little bit about your background and what makes you think you're the right fit to be a member of Congress? Obviously, you have to win the nomination first, but then you're going to have to, beat Kelly Armstrong or if there's some weird shuffling, but what makes you the most qualified person who's in this race to be the next U.S. congressman from North Dakota?
I went to a school, the Naval Academy, that calls itself a leadership laboratory. And then once you get out in the fleet, it's all about Marine Corps as an officer. Plus, I had that Navy enlisted time before that. I was Navy nuclear power, and I came in, and so you got to learn to follow before you can learn to lead. And you need to figure out. The Marine Corps has this ethos of officers eat last, and that really resonated with me. It's the reason I went Marine Corps instead of Navy out of the Naval Academy. And when you can look, when you've been that boots on the ground guy, when you've been the one turning the wrenches. I was a machinist mate, putting together valves and basically a glorified plumber working on steam propulsion systems, and so I bring that working class lunch pail mentality, and that's what we're trying to do in this campaign too. Is we're the lunch pail, steel toe boots, go to work no matter what time it is and what the weather is, and workmanship kind of mentality to the race. It's going to be a long haul, and we're basically infantry. We're getting 3 yards of dirt at a time if that's what it takes, and just keep progressing and keep at it. And I have a staff this time around. They're doing a good job so far. Because you cannot be the candidate and be the campaign manager at this level. And I want people who are going to see things and get things done, and make sure that I get things done, and force me to talk to everybody I should talk to. And, I don't come to this from we got a lot of Harvard Law grads in Congress, and I just don't come to it from that legal battle, that legal try to win the fight kind of thing. I come at it from, let's listen to subject matter experts and come to a good solution, have a dialogue towards the best solution, but let's get to at least to a workable solution, and then we can go on from there.
Who also served in the United States Navy was MC Hammer. I'm sorry. I'm so
sorry. Yeah, that is true.
He actually did. He spent 4 years in the Navy. Was a petty officer, 3rd class. This is the interview prep that I did today, as you can tell. I'm so sorry. One thing that you mentioned coming at this from being kind of the steel-toed, blue-collar worker. That's something, and you guys are Democrats, so I'm outside looking in. It seems to me that's something Democrats have lost, both nationally and frankly, I would say it here in North Dakota as well, is a connection to that class of voter. So how do you, Trygve Hammer, convince that sort of voter, of which there are a lot in North Dakota?
Yep.
How do you convince them that it's time to vote for a Democrat again?
Well, first, I totally agree, and I have actually brought that up in other interviews, and maybe that came in on your research too. I don't know, but working people feel like they've been abandoned to a large extent by the Democratic Party, and that was our thing way back when I was growing up. That is what the Democratic Party was all about, and you saw unions losing power for quite a while, and you get these trade deals, and the trade deals are great for industry. American industry makes more money after these trade deals, but the workers keep getting left behind. And you're out there on working the railroad or the oil field or whatever, and you run it. Guys know that the system is rigged. Guys know at these different companies that the CEO isn't worth his bonus, much less his base pay. And they know that they just don't have that great a quality of life. I was in a locomotive, and it was funny. There was a sticker on there, and it was in a UP locomotive, and it said, "No lives matter, UP," and it had the little UP symbol on there. And it kind of, across a lot of industries, because there's such a short-term focus now on the next quarterly earnings report and on getting good dividends out to the shareholders and taking care of the executives and the shareholders, workers are being left. They know that system is rigged against them, basically. And I think you see that feeling reflected in the renewed popularity for labor unions. And then, so UAW, they had their negotiations with GM, and GM's, they're talking like it's really going to take it out of hide for them to do this. But end of September, what do? They do a $10 billion stock buyback. So I think there is that feeling. And I know I'm sounding very populist now, but it's just a truth. And there's a lot of that feeling out there, and you got to get out there and connect. And the other thing is it's easy to think one thing about Democrats in the abstract. It's another thing to meet a Democrat. And that's something that has happened to me as I've been working, as I run into guys and women who say, well, heck, I would have voted for you, but I didn't know anything about you. And so that was my own incompetence running in the 2022 cycle. That's something we're working to overcome now.
Trygve, one of my frustrations is the idea in the United States right now that in order to be patriotic, you have to be a Republican, or somehow there's a monopoly on the right to patriotism. Obviously, with your military background, you're a patriot. Tell me about why voters should consider voting, who think that way, who think that somehow the Republicans have a monopoly on military, have a monopoly on police officers, and that they're the only ones that sort of are patriots. Can you talk a little bit about that? With your background, I got to imagine that drives you nuts.
It does. And but I kind of understand it, and that was good messaging by Republicans, and that has been a problem, is that we have let a lot of messaging come through and not countered it in the past. I'm not the only military guy running as a Democrat in this cycle. I know I've seen quite a few, and there's a Capitol Police officer who's running as a Democrat as well, running for House. And I have over and over taken that oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and saying that I take that, without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion. And I feel like every candidate has to be that way too. And it's really important in this cycle. We're starting, I think it was Elise Stefanik. I saw something on her, and she will not promise to accept the results of the election when whatever it turns out. She's not at this point ready to do that. And I think we all need to do that. There's been such an effort to undermine elections. And there was a school board election out here in Williston. Some people who don't like how that went are apparently questioning the results now. And so from the ground level all the way up to the top, we've got to have candidates who are going to restore faith in the system. With that broken, that's just, and I hate to ever question anybody's patriotism, but I really, someone who's taken that oath and then they are undermining the system in that way, I just where is your love of country? Where is your care for the Constitution? Stop creating this, stop undermining the good people who run our elections, our county auditors, the people who go in and do the counting. If you meet those people, or you go in to see that, they're not there trying to change the results. It's very concerning, and it's a threat to the Republic as far as I'm concerned.
I've used that exact term, threat to the Republic. And I think some of the perception of Republicans as being patriotic and pro law enforcement's taken some hits. I mean, how do you say you're patriotic when you're lining up behind a president who calls people convicted for their actions on January 6th, hostages or martyrs? How are you pro law enforcement when we saw state representative, granted this is one person, but State Representative Nico Rios, over in Williston, and the way he treated law enforcement, and the number, frankly, of Republicans now who are, sort of lining up and I mean, granted, House Majority Leader Mike LaFleur called him to resign, but you have the party leader, Sandy Sanford, who's hedging. It's like, well, I didn't really call on him to resign. I mean, really, you're back the blue, but you treat an officer like that. Anyway, I think there's a lot of this that's going around. I mean, on the other side of the hand, when I watched the Black Lives Matter movement torching police stations, that gave me so much. When the kneeling during the national anthem stuff, I think there has to be a return. Like, so much of that is tied up in our disrespect for institutions. And I agree with you, Trygve. There's got to be a return just back to basics. Like, we may disagree on labor policy or tax policy or what have you, but we got to get back to respecting our institutions again, which probably something you said where you were talking about, and you used the word rigged. And I'll admit that they gave me PTSD a little bit because of how often we're hearing that from the former president talking incorrectly about the 2020 election, say, oh, it's rigged and everything else. You even said you were sounding a little populist. That's a very populist thing to say right now, that things are rigged. So expand on that a little bit. Like, when you say rigged, what do you mean?
What I mean is, from the bottom view, looking up, and it's no secret that in this country we've had a big, the wealth gap has grown and the income gap has grown, and that's part of the reason that objectively, if you look at all the things we measure for the inflation, it looks really, or for the economy, it looks really good right now. It should be something, Biden is campaigning on, but down at the ground level where wages have not kept up for, 40 some years now.
It doesn't look as good when it doesn't look as good when I go to the grocery store.
Exactly. So there's that disconnect, and we, you have to have wage growth to help make up for that, for inflation. Inflation now is down under 3%. I want to say it's back to the kind of the target that you're looking for. One thing I'll say on that though is, President Biden has not tried to. He doesn't say anything about the Fed. He doesn't try to influence the Fed in his speeches or anything like that. He looks at it and sees that separation between the presidency and the Fed, the president, the White House, and the judiciary. And I think, he wasn't my guy to start with, but maybe the fact that we have an older institutionalist right now is kind of almost what we needed after that. And I wasn't planning to go into the presidential race at all, but I just think that we need people all through who are going to restore faith in the system, and Americans need to understand that when we do reach the next, January 6th and going into that process, every congressman and every senator will have made it clear that, their responsibility at that is basically, and the vice president's, is basically like, I recently went to my daughter's college graduation out in Norfolk, and they had, 2 lines going up to the stage, and there were readers up there calling off the names, and there was a guest speaker, a congressman, and I forget who it was. I should probably remember. But he was up there, shaking hands as they would depart the stage. That is the amount of authority that Congress has and the vice president has on that day. They get the electors in. The electors have already been approved. I think it happened December 14th in 2020. And what they're doing is basically ceremonial. We can't have people believing that is a time when after everything else has been weighed and there have been the court cases, that all of a sudden now these congressmen and senators can object and can somehow change the slate. It's not the truth. And there's no reason to gather around the Capitol or storm the Capitol, because under the Constitution, you can't change anything. And in a way, I feel like those objectors really did. One, they provided aid and comfort to those who were invading the Capitol. And two, they deceived those people into thinking that they did have some power to change it. It was totally irresponsible. And we as candidates, and we need to make that clear. And I almost feel like there should be an oath of office for candidates. Now, you talked about bad behavior here in North Dakota, and there is a little bit of democratic responsibility for that. Our party, so there'll be people who read your articles, Rob, and listen to this podcast, and they I'm guessing know about all this stuff. What you discover when you're campaigning, when you're out meeting people, there are a lot of people who will not know anything about this, right? And it would be political malpractice for Democrats in this cycle to not be getting that out there. It's out in the media, but not everybody reads a newspaper. There are, we have low information voters, and I don't mean that as a pejorative. I mean it as a lot of people just don't have time to consume news. They got enough going on. They're trying to pay the bills, and they don't know about any of this stuff. We, basically the opposition party here in North Dakota, we have to hold people accountable. We have to hold the Republicans accountable for their bad behavior. And right now, like the thing with Wayne Stenjum's emails being wiped from the server, in a healthy, ethical ecosystem, that doesn't happen. Someone might order it, but IT, someone in IT is going to say, wait a minute, that just doesn't sound right. And it won't happen. And I don't blame the IT guys. I'm not putting it on them because they are in this ecosystem. And, I think the Republican Party and especially those in power need to be held accountable for creating that ecosystem. And we do that by getting that information out there, by campaigning and letting them know. Now, most of that's, the stuff that's happened in the state is below the U.S. House level, but it's something that we need to do as a party. And I am not just about my race. I'm a district chairman. I'm of 5. I've actually moved into District 3 now, and so neither of those districts has a race this time around. But I'm helping to recruit candidates so we have one we recently got for 38, and we'll be getting on the Secretary of State website sometime here for that race. And I've got someone I'm going to call down in Lisbon later today and talk to them about running. And and if there's some Democrats listening to this and they're on the edge and thinking about, anybody who's thinking about running, but they feel like, I just don't know enough. There's always going to be stuff you don't know. If you want to go there and serve, and that's your attitude, that's the important thing. So get into the race, and it sucks to lose, even when you go in a huge underdog. It sucks to lose, but it's you're putting yourself out there. You're adding your voice and the voice of everyone who supports you to the debate, and it's important. And people should not be afraid to take part in the system.
Trygve, going back to January 6th, and I think everything you said about January 6th and the concerns leading up to that are accurate concerns. With that said, the person you're running against actually voted to certify the election. And so, do you have criticisms of the way that Kelly Armstrong specifically handled that, even though he voted to certify the election and has said very clearly that the election was not rigged or stolen or whatever? Are there things that you'd like to see that how he could have handled that differently to help in the big picture? Yeah.
Well, first of all, I got to say, I sympathize with him. He's been put in kind of a pickle by a lot of these bad actors in his own party. But, I believe he did then, vote for Jim Jordan for Speaker of the House at one point. And even having McCarthy as a Speaker of the House, McCarthy was so much, say one thing to one guy and one thing to another. Democrats couldn't count on him to not renege on any deal ever. So, we had this circus going on where they're trying to find a speaker and they got to vote for someone. But when you're doing that, you're voting for a guy. Jim Jordan was very much part of that. Even McCarthy said, okay, we're going to resume the objections when they came back that night on January 6th. And Mike Johnson I believe he even helped author an amicus brief or was getting people to sign for it. And, so there are a lot of them in there that were involved in that. And the only way that, this subset of the Republican Party that has seized control, and, right now we're looking again, January 19th, we might have another, deadline or another, come up to the brink of a government shutdown. And it's because of this little subset that has the control, that one person can say, okay, Speaker, we can vote this guy out now. And there have been threats for that. And the only way that those people are not in control is actually if you have a Democratic majority.
I appreciate your comments about Congressman Armstrong being a pickle. I mean, it seems like a lot of Republicans are, I think even when they know what's right and wrong, and I think privately would say it, are afraid to speak about it publicly. I mean, Kelly, I think, gets some credit. I mean, he's said some things, but also he was at the Stop the Steal rally in Bismarck shortly after the election, and he spoke there along with Kevin Kramer and John Hoeven. So that's a very interesting dynamic. I wondered if for you though, Trygve, if you were to be elected to the United States House, barring some massive change in the 2024 election, you would be joining a House caucus that is mostly urban. How do you? I mean, you could talk about one thing. How do you bridge the gap with Republicans, things like that? How do you bridge the gap with your own party if you were to be a Democrat elected from a rural agriculture, small, frankly, conservative state? I mean that maybe less politically than it sounds, but a pretty conservative state. How do you bridge the gap with your own party?
I think you just, if I have one model for this, it's my dad. My dad's a real, he will talk to anyone. And what I have found is that you need to get out and have those one-on-one conversations. And it's more important than being a strident voice in the House itself, at the microphone or in the committee. You have got to get out and get one-on-one with these other congressmen. You've got to be a voice when the cameras aren't on and you aren't getting any credit for it. That's where you really need to build relationships, and because until you do that, you can't make people understand, where you're coming from. You got to build that relationship, build that trust, and one thing I look at Hakeem Jeffries. He's a New York guy, and one thing he's done well is he has really held the Democratic caucus together. I think it was Mark Twain said that, I'm not a member of any organized party, I'm a Democrat. And, Democrats have been like that a good amount of the time, but they have been very disciplined in this last cycle. So you find what their concerns are. I need to, talk to them about that, and then say, what are our rural concerns? And also, you cannot keep considering us flyover country. We're out here, we matter, and you really need to think about our priorities as well. And I don't think they completely abandoned them, but what's important to you and what's important to the people, what North Dakotans are calling you about, you got to get it to your neighbors up there in the U.S. House, to the people in your caucus.
That comment about the Democratic Party, that was actually Will Rogers who said that.
Oh, okay.
Although I completely understand why he would be confused, mixed up with Twain. Rogers was a very Twainian figure in American politics.
So, Trygve, one of the things that was discussed quite a bit during the last congressional race was the infrastructure vote. Hoeven and Kramer voted for the bipartisan infrastructure bill. Congressman Armstrong voted against it. And at that time, the projects weren't being deployed yet. We're starting to see those projects being deployed. My favorite one is that they're changing the intersection at the corner of I think it's 42nd and Demers and Grand Forks, so you don't have to wait behind a train track for a long time. Where I missed a lot of class at UND because of that. But $36 million.
That's why you missed class.
Listen, yeah, there you go. But, I mean, as we see the deployment of these things, I think it's more apparent that bill was good for North Dakota. Do you want to talk a little bit about the fact that Kelly wasn't for that, but the two senators were for it?
Yeah, that was actually one of his votes that I don't understand so much. And that bill also it's another example of where you look at the whole, or look at it in the abstract, and you can be against it. But then once things actually start happening and we get things built, and all of a sudden you're realizing, oh no, it's not another infrastructure week. We're actually getting infrastructure, and infrastructure matters. My dad, he was a state highway department employee. He has his pension from there now, a defined benefit pension, which is, awesome. He was also mayor of Velva for a while, and he's a really affable guy. It is hard to get under his skin, but take him out for a drive and go down the street, and that manhole cover's too low. There's no excuse for this road. That's the one thing that kind of gets under his skin, and infrastructure, people notice it and people use it, and we need to take care of it. And another thing he did was he was a bridge inspector, and a lot of that infrastructure has been, some bridges across the country, a lot of bridges across the country have really poor grades right now, and we needed to fix it. And now finally we've got it addressed. So, and if Representative Armstrong was against it then and decides to be, for some of these projects now, I actually wouldn't think that was hypocrisy. I would understand that, but I still don't understand his vote. I don't see it from his perspective when he made that vote.
Trygve, I really like you coming on. at the end of the day, I'm a conservative, and you're not, and I think that makes it hard for someone like me to vote for you. But one thing I really like that you've said is this refocusing on public service, because I think right now we have a lot of people who are running for office and maybe not just in North Dakota, it's more of a national, but for the celebrity of it, or running for office because they want to fight the culture wars. They want to jump in, and their whole reason for being in office is not to worry about manhole covers and roads and bridges and railroads and all those things, but to worry about how can I stick it to liberals? How can I make liberals upset if you're a Republican, or vice versa for Democrats, where we're just out there to stick it to these red state yokels and do things that make them mad. Or refocusing on, no, it's about how do we serve the public? How do we make our country great because we have good roads and good schools and strong economy and lots of opportunity for everybody. So I really appreciate that part of your message. And I appreciate you coming on today.
And I appreciate you getting in this race, Trygve, because I think it is important that we have competitive races with substantial people on both sides. And I think you're a substantial person who can have conversations about things that matter to voters. So thanks for getting in. I know it's not going to be an easy race, but appreciate you doing it.
Oh, well, happy to be here. I'm actually at the point where I'm getting tired of talking about myself, but
oh man, you're just getting started. You're in the wrong business.
I know. It's kind of crazy. And like I said, you go to make that phone call and you're like, who am I to ask this person for money? And then you kind of recalibrate. And sometimes you end up, being that person's therapist for a little while. It's like, especially in North Dakota, and you're, talking to Democrats across the state, you're like, hey, it's not that bad. Buck up, buddy. You can do it.
Well, good luck out there. Certainly appreciate you coming on. And I'm certain we'll be talking to you again as the campaign rolls on.
Hi there, my name is James Wallner. I produce and host the podcast Dakota Spotlight, a true crime podcast that tackles historical and unsolved crimes in the upper Midwest. Follow along with me as we search for a missing girl, attempt to solve a 45-year-old murder, and much, much more. That's Dakota Spotlight Podcast, anywhere you get your podcasts, or at inforum.com/podcasts.
All right, finish up our interview with Trygve Hammer. And I like talking to Trygve. I think he is refreshing as a Democratic candidate. He's talking about some things, articulate. Listen, there's a lot of people in American politics who like to evoke the blue collar thing, the steel toe boots and blue collar, all that stuff. I think he really does. I think he is from an older mold of, maybe a 1970s, 1980s era Democrat, where you have, like a strong labor background and stuff like that. I find that refreshing. Like, I find that very appealing. For obvious reasons, he's got some positions that I don't agree with, but I really think that's the sort of candidate, especially in a place like North Dakota, that can bring the Republicans here, frankly, some needed competition.
Right, and it's an interesting contrast. The folks that we have currently representing us in the, I think about Hoven and Armstrong and Burgum. It's they're wealthy, very successful financially, and even when you look at Congress, there's not a lot of people who are working folks. Trygve's military background, working the oil fields, he's worked as a teacher. I think it's a different perspective. And I'm not suggesting that people who are wealthy have bad perspectives or anything like that. It's just different. And so I think the more
I think the point we're making is that there's not a balance right now.
Right.
We could say lots of things about the Republican Party not having balance, but in the Democratic Party, there's not a balance right now. We're not saying that urban points of view or people who are financially successful, that their points of view don't matter. We're just saying there's so many of them in the Democratic Party right now. There's got to be other points of view as well.
Right. And I think your question about how do you build bridges within the caucus, I mean, this idea that the majority of Congress, and we had Matt Lewis talk about this, that the majority of Congress is wealthy, that's not a Republican thing. I mean, Democrats, there's a lot of rich Democrats there too.
Some of the wealthiest are, at one point, like some of the, like the top 8 or 9 spots on the list were all Democrats.
Right. And having somebody like Trygve, and I think Senator Heitkamp served that purpose for a while. Kent, Byron, and Earl was a different time. There were far more sort of rural blue seats back then. But I do wish, as somebody who would like to see Democrats do better nationally, that there would be more listening to this part of the country, because I think he's exactly right with the working folks. Those are the people that Democrats have lost. I mean, there's just no doubt about it. Even within unions, a traditional block of Democrat voters, there's a lot of unions that are flirting with Trump. I saw the Teamsters. I think it was the Teamsters just met with Trump. So I think it's a focus that needs to take place. They've proven they can win and they can get to a 51 seat majority in the Senate and maybe win the presidency by the skin of their teeth. If you don't start competing in these parts of the country, you're never going to get to where we were where the Democratic Party was 20 years ago. I mean, think about it, Rob. We had Democrats held both seats in South Dakota, both seats in North Dakota, and 1 seat in Montana. 2 seats in Montana, maybe at one point. That's 5 additional seats in the U.S. Senate right now. That'd make a world of difference in pushing President Biden's agenda.
I don't disagree with you. I mean, and frankly, I mean, when I look at some of what the Republican Party has become, because Republicans in this part of the world aren't fearing that right now, they're not really afraid of it. I think that's a big part of the problem. I mean, competition is good. I'm saying that not as somebody who is all that keen on seeing Democrats elected to Congress. I'm saying that as an American who wants the system to function better than it is.
And you get left with more fringy candidates, right? I mean, if you're only competing in the primary and Republicans are the only one deciding who goes to Congress in a lot of districts, or Democrats on the other side, you often end up with the people who are the furthest left or the furthest right, and not the people, not legislators,
Sure.
who are where the vast majority of Americans are.
Those ultra red or ultra blue districts are where you have, Ocasio-Cortez or Matt Gaetz. That's where they're elected.
Right.
And because because Republicans feel safe there to indulge some of the most extreme, or Democrats, as it were, to indulge some of their most, extreme inclinations. All right. Well, I'm really looking forward to this U.S. House race, because I really like and respect both candidates.
Me too.
In the race. And I feel like both of them are going to be very capable of having a very substantive campaign.
And civil. Trygve's not going to be throwing bombs out there, and I don't think Kelly's going to be.
There's going to be some sharp elbows. There's going to be some sharp criticism, but that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that.
Right. But that's different than calling names or those sort of things. They're going to have disagreements, and that's going to be.
And they should.
Fantastic.
I mean, the whole point of this is compare and contrast. Right. All right. So you were telling me you got a lot of feedback on our interview with former state senator Tom Campbell and his gubernatorial aspirations.
Yeah, I think a lot of people I was hearing from were underwhelmed by his performance on the podcast a few days ago.
Yeah.
I think, and you wrote about it, that first chunk of the interview when he said he wasn't going to talk about Doug Burgum, or wasn't on to bash Doug Burgum, and then he just bashed Doug Burgum, and then sort of using I haven't decided if I'm going to run or not. Well, if you're still working on this, you have to have a reason why you're running. And so I think I talked to Republicans primarily. We're like, what is he doing here? Just bashing Burgum for the sake of it. It's strange.
I think
it's a weird path.
I think the confusion he's creating is based on the fact that he's not really owning his criticism, right?
Right.
Like he clearly wants to run for governor, but he won't commit to it, and he's clearly very whether you and I agree with it or not, he's clearly very critical of Doug Burgum, but he also doesn't want to own the criticism, so that's why he couches everything in, I maybe want to run for governor, but I haven't made up my mind yet. I'm not here to bash Doug, but here's 6 minutes of all the things I think that are wrong with him, including some stuff that's not really, the stuff about, he made us look like a hick state and stuff like that. I first of all, I don't agree with that with the president. I had my criticism of the presidential campaign. I don't think he diminished North Dakota at all. But second of all, that's bashing. Like, don't say I'm not here to bash Doug, and then you bash Doug for 6 minutes. Like, I don't understand that.
I also think that there is a way to be critical of the governor in a way that is effective. Maybe it's not all fair, but Doug Burgum did choose to go and run for president for 6 months. And does that mean that the state of North Dakota is his fallback plan? He could say that. I don't know if that's true, but there are like legit criticisms. The idea I know a guy who called me and said this one thing this one time, and therefore nobody likes Doug Burgum. It's just nonsense. Or I have a friend who did an informal poll of his buddies, and you know what that informal poll probably looked like? Hey, my good friend Tom Campbell's thinking about running for governor. Don't you think he'd be a good governor? Well, I suppose. Yeah. And there you've got your poll.
Sometimes I poll, 100% of the people sitting in my living room, like the New York Yankees. So, it's just me and my family. Yeah. So, I don't know how useful that is. I think it's because he's not owning the criticism. If you're going to come out and criticize somebody, you can't count. Like, I make a living out of criticizing people, right? And you have to own it. And right. Also, if it's somebody that you've also supported, you have to explain, like 6 months ago during this presidential campaign where you suggested that Burgum was trying to buy the presidency. Well, some of the money he was using was money that you raised for him at your lake cabin. So you need to, if you're going to be critical of him, you got to acknowledge that. You got to say, listen, I really supported Doug taking a shot at running for the presidency. But also his aspirations are clearly somewhere else. He's distracted, and it's time for him to move on and focus on those things and let somebody else take over as governor. To me, that's a lot more meaningful criticism. That's a lot more credible than what Campbell was saying.
Well, and again, he was basically making the case of why Doug Burgum is beatable from his perspective. That's how he spent that whole time. I've got this source, or he did this, he did this. At no point, the compelling reason for Tom Campbell to run for governor right now seems to be that he thinks Doug Burgum can be beaten. Full stop. That's what he thinks the reason is that he should run for governor. From my perspective, I don't think wanting to be governor because it's good for it's because you're thirsty to be governor is not a good reason. I also think, I didn't hear any there of why he wants to be governor. I think if Doug Burgum chooses to run a third term, he's going to win with or without Tom Campbell getting in this race. And at least I think Doug Burgum knows why he'd run for a third term. I think Doug Burgum knows why he ran for governor. Doug Burgum knows why, he wants to do this stuff.
Whatever else you want to say about Doug, he's got ideas. You may agree with, you may disagree with him, agree with him, and
some of them are absolutely terrible. But he has ideas
from your perspective.
Yes,
but he's accomplished some things. Some real things, and I think if he does run again, this is me imagining what he would run on, but things like finishing off the income tax, finishing the Teddy Roosevelt Library, and some of the other things work. The most interesting part of the interview with Campbell was he did get in at the end where he started talking about, what is it, H-2A visas? I think that's it. So that's immigration policy. That's and that, by the way, that speaks to workforce shortages in our state, which are a chronic problem. So that's interesting stuff. He
talked about property tax proposals that are different
about capping property taxes at the local level, which has been brought up before and it's been controversial, but also property tax as an issue has festered for a long time. Maybe it's time to put that idea back on the table. That's interesting stuff. He should be leading with that.
Right. And he could, and Doug Burgum has said during the last session, the state has nothing to do with property taxes. This is a local, and I think you can make that case. That's a clear contrast. Tom Campbell saying the state should do something to stop property taxes. Doug Burgum saying let's control the taxes that we can control, and that's income taxes. That's a difference between those two, and an interesting contrast.
Yeah. So talk
that's
about
what we heard in the first half of the interview.
I think when you said that he's thirsty to be governor, I think that's right. And I think when you look at what we have in the public record, we can all guess what Tom Campbell's desires are in his heart, but those just us guessing. What we have in the public record is in 2018 he tried to run for Senate, was pushed out of the race by Kramer. In 2018 he ran for the House and was defeated for the party endorsement by Kelly Armstrong, and then opted not to run to the June primary.
After he first announced he was going to,
and then there's the rumors he wanted that appointment to the Public Service Commission. I reported on that and was passed over for it. The fact that Tom Campbell was thirsty for an office, clear. And there's nothing wrong with having ambition, but ambition is in and of itself is not a reason. That's not the case you make to voters. Tom Campbell really wants to hold one of these offices.
Right.
And it's just, I think you're starting to run into, maybe not with the general public, but certainly with the engaged political audience where, starting to say, Tom kind of seems like he looks at elected office like it's a social club, like a very exclusive social club that he'd really, really like to join.
Yeah. And even him describing himself as a frontline worker, I had some people who were like, what? He's been a very successful businessman, a very successful farmer, a very successful banker. I don't think a lot of people consider that a frontline worker. If he gets in, I hope he tightens his stuff up so it's an interesting campaign. But what we saw or heard last Wednesday, I'm not 100% convinced that there's going to be a lot of there.
So the other big thing going on is the Jason Doctor situation. Right. I called on him to resign. I know that there's criminal charges pending, a criminal charge pending, a misdemeanor charge that's a result from an ethics complaint. The Ethics Commission referred it, and that's the statute they referred it under. I honestly I think there's going to be a tough time getting a conviction on that. But to me, it doesn't rise to the level. I think he should resign. Because I don't know whether or not he committed a crime. The courts are going to speak on that eventually. I look at what happened, and I know he did something wrong. And I think for that, and maybe it seems like small potatoes in this environment where, we have somebody who used homophobic slurs and bigoted comments and everything and berated a cop for 45 minutes to try to use his legislative position to get out of a DUI arrest. All these things. So maybe this means like small potatoes compared to that because Representative Rios hasn't resigned. But I don't know. I think if you're using your office to serve yourself, then you need to go.
Rob, why is it small potatoes though compared to what Rios did?
I'm not. I guess that's maybe the perception because there's so many egregious things going on right now.
Understood.
Yeah.
But I think that if you really think about this, so, Rios did these terrible things, berated a police officer, 2 or 3 police officers for 45 minutes. Conceivably what Doctor is accused of here is using his seat to personally enrich himself based on taxpayer dollars. That's a pretty big deal. And one of the things I worry about is the Rios thing is, it pops, right? And he's not in that
salacious. It's more salacious.
Yeah. And he admitted to it. That's the other thing that makes it a little easier to call for his resignation.
Also, the slurs and everything are on video. Like, you can sit and watch the video.
And so, but I think when we talked about the Rios thing and we had LaFleur on and then we talked about it later, we talked a little bit about it would be interesting to see if this was a traditional Republican, if the same things would be happening, if there'd be the same calls for resignation. other than you, nobody's called for Doctor's resignation over the things that he's did. And there are some differences. There's certainly between he and Rios. There's no video or whatever. And he hasn't been convicted of a crime.
And it's more complex. I mean, it's a little more difficult maybe to sort through all the numbers and everything and wrap your arms around it.
But there's a lot there, right? I mean, you just read that Montana report, and even if it doesn't rise to criminal, him getting convicted, there's a lot there to indicate there was some really, really sketchy stuff that took place in order to personally enrich a legislator by using his seat in the legislature, which could be very much thought of as much worse than just berating one individual or a handful of individuals in Williston.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're both bad. And again, I mean, I got some pushback from people when I called for him to resign. They said it was too hasty. We ought to let the criminal case, unfold. And I think that is a problem where sometimes we get hung up in this idea where we're bringing the standards of the criminal justice system into the political system. And I know everybody, politics, bad word and all that stuff. But, I mean, serving in elected office is a privilege, right? I mean, the criminal justice system deals with your civil rights. Like if you get convicted and you get put in jail, they're denying you certain civil rights as punishment. Like there are really high standards for that. I mean, in some places where we have the death penalty, they can deny you your life. They can deny you your property. They can deny you your liberty. But serving in elected office is not a right. Nobody has a right to their legislative seat or whatever office they're holding. It's a privilege. And I mean, my personal opinion, and I'm not the arbiter. I mean, ultimately, it's up to the voters in his legislative district. But as a taxpayer and as a voter and as a citizen, that's the standard I want to set for people who are in elected office. Don't use that office. Don't use that office to enrich yourself. And I understand all the arguments law make. We have a part-time legislature and people got to make a living. And I'm sympathetic to all of that. We've had those debates in the past. It's been frankly a struggle as we've been debating ethics and everything. It's a difficult thing. I mean, sometimes lawmakers who are not doing anything wrong are maybe put in uncomfortable decisions because something they're doing in the legislature intersects with something that they make money from in their private life. I don't want to deny anybody the ability to make a living, but this is beyond that.
It is very much beyond that. When he walks down the hall and talks to a state employee about sort of what is needed, and then he uses that lease in order to secure the building.
Right.
And then the costs end up being more. And he goes to the office of the person he served as the treasurer for his gubernatorial campaign. I mean, there's a lot of different stuff here. I also think that there is when you had Representative Doctor on the podcast, we interviewed him. By the way, you should repost that interview. I think it'd be interesting for people to listen to that. One of the things that I remember being sort of shocked by is he didn't seem to get why it would be unethical or why it was perceived to be unethical. And my bigger concern there is, does he not get that? Because that's just sort of the way things work in the state capitol of the North Dakota legislature. That's my bigger concern, that people don't see this as a big deal because, this is what people do.
It speaks to a culture problem. Right. It speaks to a lot of people who've been in office for a while. And it's just, like you said, it's just the way things happen. It's just the way things get done. Not only does that connotate that there may be other deals that we don't know about that haven't gotten this amount of attention, but also because, they become just sort of inured to it. I don't, when I was writing about the filmmakers controversy earlier this year, and if people don't know this, it was a grant. It was like $600,000 in grants that were basically directed by the legislature to one company, and supposedly there was going to be a competitive process for these grants where lots of filmmakers could apply for them, but the legislature, made it clear where they wanted it to go, and so the competitive process became sort of farcical. They had like 10 days. To put in for a grant for $500,000. It was kind of clear where it was going the whole time, and people were surprised. Like I talked to a lot of people who were surprised that people found that to be controversial. Like, well, what's the big deal? Well, I feel like you're in an environment and like maybe you're not understanding that this is very problematic. If you're going to put out a competitive grant, people really do expect it to be competitive. I mean, there were a lot of people on that film grant thing who put time into putting in a submission, not understanding the winner had really already been picked.
Right. And it goes to the Global Bridges money. There's certain nonprofits.
Global Bridges money, that being part of the Holmberg scandal.
Right.
Global Bridges being the program which he traveled to Europe allegedly to have, at which time he's accused in federal court of having raped children.
Yeah. But and that was earmarked money. There are nonprofits in Bismarck and Mandan and around the state who have had money earmarked for them. That, I mean, all of those things seem like that's not the way we should be doing business, right? I mean, if we're going to put aside a bunch of money for science centers or art centers, which I very much support, shouldn't everybody be eligible for those kind of programs?
You have to do it the right way.
One that gets earmarked.
Also, we have a provision in the state constitution that's the gifting clause, where you're not supposed to just direct money. That's the whole reason we have these competitive processes. If you're appropriating money to a grant program, which is competitive, where lots of people can apply and there's a process and some people get awarded money, that doesn't violate the gift clause. If you put your finger on the scale and you say, we want this company to get the money, that violates the Constitution in my mind.
Well, yeah, and I just mentioned a couple, but you could go through the list of just the last sessions where it's like, even places where it's like this $3 million is going towards this, but wink and a nod, we know who the vendor is, who's going to, get this money or implement this program or whatever. And it's just, it's sort of this is the way we've always done things. Hopefully after the PERS lawsuit and the single subject lawsuit that we learn a little bit that just because we've always done things a certain way.
Let's be honest. I think Chad, you and I follow the political process closer. I mean, there are not many people that follow it more closely than we are. I wasn't exactly thinking about a lot of this stuff. I don't think you were. I think it's and there's nothing wrong with that. Like maybe we're all being woke up. There's a better way to do this. So let's be better. Let's raise the bar for ourselves and do better at this. I think
wasn't Drew's office going to look at all the sort of pass through money and all the different options? I think there's some, and not for legal reasons, but I think just sort of making sure that the way things have been done in the past are following the law.
If they are, I guess I don't know. I don't know. Okay. Maybe. I mean, that sounds like a worthy review, but I don't know if they're doing it or not. But we're going to put a pin in it there. Thank you so much for listening. Certainly appreciate it, as always. I noticed people leaving more reviews for the podcast on the various platforms, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or whatever. That really helps people find the podcast when people do reviews or do ratings. So if you would leave an honest rating or review, that's really great. But as always, appreciate you listening, and stay warm out there, and we'll talk again. Did you know Forum Communications Company has a robust podcast library? At inforum.com/podcasts, we have everything from politics, sports, true crime, outdoor adventure, and more. Visit inforum.com/podcasts and explore them all today.